I'm Francesca, 42 years old, and I never imagined I would see my marriage unravel the way it did. My husband, David, has always been a careful man, or so I thought. Married for 16 years, we shared a small suburban house, a quiet neighborhood, and a life that on the surface seemed ordinary. But that evening, something shifted. Something subtle yet piercing, like a shadow moving across a familiar room. It began with a glance, a hesitation, a secret I couldn't name yet. I followed him to a place I shouldn't have known existed, and what I discovered changed everything. But I didn't make a scene. What I did was far worse. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family drama, betrayal, and emotional courage. It started on an otherwise normal Thursday evening. David had left for work earlier than usual, claiming it was a last-minute shift change. I remember thinking nothing of it until I noticed his car sitting in the driveway longer than it should have in the morning. I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard him step outside, mumbling something under his breath. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was the kind of quiet tension that makes a person's movements seem smaller, restrained, like they are holding themselves back. I tried to brush it off. Everyone has tense days. But as I went about my chores, I noticed little things that didn't add up. His keys weren't on the hook by the door, as they usually were. The coffee cup he had left in the sink in the morning had been moved, as though someone had used it and returned it carefully. Even his favorite chair, the one he always slouched in after work, was unusually straight. It was subtle, but in 16 years, I had memorized the rhythm of his life. Something was off. The unease grew when I looked out the kitchen window and saw his car leave, except it wasn't going toward his usual route to the office. It turned toward Hillcrest Road, a stretch we rarely visited except for the occasional visit to the hardware store or the library. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I shouldn't follow him. Part of me screamed to stay put, to trust him. But another part, the part that had started noticing these small, almost imperceptible changes over the last few weeks, insisted I see where he was going. I grabbed my coat and slipped quietly out the door, making sure not to be seen. The street was quiet, the kind of silence that makes even the faintest noises echo. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt from an earlier rain. My hands felt clammy as I gripped the steering wheel, my pulse thudding like a drumbeat against my ribs. Every instinct told me to turn back, to stop, but curiosity gnawed at me. By the time I reached the intersection that led to Hillcrest Road, I could see him in the distance. His back was straight, his pace steady, and yet there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. As I followed, I noticed small details I had never paid attention to before. He frequently glanced over his shoulder, checking behind him as if someone were following. He slowed near a stretch of unkempt buildings I had never noticed, a row of storage units tucked between abandoned lots. He reached one unit in particular and fumbled with a key I had never seen him use. The key caught the dim light from the street lamp, flashing briefly before slipping into the lock. My stomach knotted. I parked my car a block away, keeping it in the shadows. I tried to calm myself with deep breaths, telling myself it could be innocent. Maybe it was a surprise for me, an errand, a gift, something simple. But as I watched him enter, closing the heavy door behind him, I felt a flicker of dread I could not explain. It was the kind of fear that doesn't scream. It whispers, persistent and chilling. While waiting, I remembered small moments from the past month. The nights he said he was working late but came home later than necessary, smelling faintly of something unfamiliar. The excuses about extra shifts, last-minute meetings, or errands that never quite added up. At first, I told myself I was imagining things, letting my mind create patterns where none existed. But now, seeing him at this strange, isolated storage unit, The puzzle pieces clicked together uncomfortably. I considered turning the car around and going home, pretending I had never noticed, but something in me, a mix of fear, curiosity, and a stubborn sense of justice, kept me rooted. I watched as the door swung open again, and David carefully removed a box, lifting it with precision and sliding it inside. I couldn't see the contents, but I could see the care, the secrecy. He wasn't clumsy. He wasn't distracted. He was deliberate. It was then that a rush of emotion hit me, a cocktail of shock, confusion, and something I hadn't expected. Anger. How long had he been doing this? What had he been hiding? My hands tightened on the steering wheel as my mind raced, trying to recall every small inconsistency over the last few weeks. The money he claimed was missing from the account, the nights he refused to answer his phone immediately, the late-night text messages he dismissed with vague excuses. It all made sense now. Or, at least, I thought it did. I didn't move immediately. I stayed in the car, pretending to look at my phone, even though I couldn't take my eyes off the unit. My pulse raced, yet a strange calm settled in my chest. I realized I didn't need to confront him here, not tonight, not in this shadowy place. The situation demanded observation, careful attention, and patience. What I was feeling wasn't just betrayal. It was the first spark of a plan forming, a quiet realization that I could turn this discovery to my advantage. As I waited, I noticed a small detail that made my heart stop again. David had left the unit door slightly ajar when he carried out another box. I could see the faint outlines of stacked containers inside, orderly but clearly intentional. I realized then that this wasn't a one-time event, and in the quiet of my kitchen, I whispered to myself, I didn't make a scene, but what I planned to do next would be far worse. This was a process, a routine he had carefully maintained over time. And in that moment, I felt the sharp clarity of understanding. I was witnessing a side of him I had never known, a side that had been deliberately hidden from me for months, perhaps years. The air around me seemed heavier as I sat there, processing. I remembered how just last week he had laughed off my question about the odd charges on our joint account, claiming it was probably a bank error. The memory twisted in my mind now. It wasn't an error. It was deliberate, coordinated. He had been planning something right under my nose, and I had been oblivious, or at least I had tried to be. Finally, he returned to the unit one last time before driving away, leaving the door ajar and the faint smell of cardboard and musty storage drifting into the night air. My decision crystallized in that instant. I would follow this carefully. I would see this through quietly. I wouldn't confront him here, in the shadows, risking a scene. Instead, I would learn, observe, and prepare. My thoughts raced, not with immediate revenge, but with careful calculation. I followed him back onto the main road, keeping my distance while maintaining line of sight. My mind was a whirlpool of memories, suspicions, and realizations. The trust one had placed in him for 16 years had begun to fracture, but not completely. There was a strange, fierce determination that rose within me, a refusal to be blindsided or powerless. I felt myself transforming, the seed of action planting itself, quietly ready to grow. When we returned home, I pretended as if nothing had happened. David went inside, humming softly, unaware of the watchful eyes that had traced his every step. I poured myself a cup of tea, hands trembling slightly, staring out the window at the darkened street. The memory of that storage unit, the smell, the secrecy, the deliberate care with which he moved each box, etched itself into my mind. I realized then that this was the turning point. My life, my marriage, and my trust had reached a threshold that would never allow me to remain passive again. I parked a block away from the storage facility, my hands still gripping the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white from tension. The evening air had grown colder as the sun disappeared behind a veil of clouds, leaving the lot drenched in gray shadows. The kind of shadows that seemed to twist familiar objects into something threatening. My breath puffed out in faint clouds, merging with the fog creeping along the asphalt. I could still see David's silhouette, small and careful, as he vanished behind the metal door of the unit. The rows of storage units stretched farther than I had expected. Each one was identical, gray metal doors, chipped paint, little numbers stenciled on them. Normally, this place would have seemed mundane, unremarkable. But now, with the knowledge that David was here, everything felt sinister. The entire lot seemed alive, every shadow a silent observer, every creaking hinge a potential secret waiting to be uncovered. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. I hesitated before stepping out of the car, wondering if I was crossing a line I could never come back from. But the urge to see what he was doing, why he needed this place, why he moved in secrecy, was stronger than fear. I adjusted my coat, pulled my hair behind my ears, and inched toward the first row of units. The gravel crunched under my shoes, loud in the quiet night, and I froze, heart hammering, as if David could hear it from inside. I noticed the subtle differences between the units as I moved closer. Some doors were warped from rust. Others had padlocks so shiny they reflected the pale streetlight. A stray cat scurried between two rows, knocking over a can that clanged against the metal walls. The sound echoed in the lot, making my stomach twist. I crouched behind a row of units for cover, peeking out cautiously, scanning for signs that David had noticed me. He hadn't moved yet, though, still focused, deliberate, meticulous in ways I hadn't seen him in years. I realized, then, that this place was oddly organized for being abandoned on the surface. Between the units, small piles of debris were neatly stacked, like someone had taken care not to disturb the space too much. It was a small detail, but it screamed premeditation. Whoever had been using this facility cared about appearances. Even more chilling was the thought that David had likely been doing this for weeks, or months, without me noticing. Each unit told a story of secrecy. Each number on the door a locked chapter one was only now discovering. As I inched closer to the unit David had entered, I noticed a faded sticker on the adjacent door. No trespassing. The letters were chipped, almost illegible, but the warning cut through me like a blade. I knew I was technically trespassing just by being here, yet the thought of turning back felt impossible. The curiosity that had led me here had transformed into a kind of urgent necessity. I needed to understand. I needed to see. And I needed to do it quietly without tipping him off. Peering around the corner, I watched David carefully sliding another box into the unit. He paused midway, looked around, and adjusted it as if it were delicate. I could see the strain in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled slightly, not from physical exertion, but from tension, from a weight he had been carrying in secret. It wasn't just about the boxes or the items they contained. It was about the hidden life he had constructed away from me. And yet he was alone in this, meticulous in his secrecy. A gust of wind blew across the lot, scattering loose gravel and dried leaves. The noise made me flinch and stumble back, slightly bumping against the side of a unit. My heart lurched as if the sound had betrayed me. I paused, listening for any reaction from David. Silence. He hadn't noticed. That silence, oddly, made the space feel more oppressive. It was a quiet I hadn't felt in a long time, a stillness loaded with unspoken truths. I took another step, moving parallel to the unit, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. I noticed small footprints in the dirt near the adjacent unit, fresh, perhaps from someone who had arrived earlier. I didn't see anyone now, but the realization made me aware that I wasn't just witnessing his secret. I might be witnessing one he thought was entirely hidden. It was unnerving, realizing that in such a seemingly empty place, we were never truly alone. Leaning closer to peek around the corner again, I caught a glint of metal, a lockbox tucked behind one of the stacks. It wasn't large, but it was distinct. Something about it screamed importance. David bent slightly to pick up another box, completely unaware that I had seen it. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it money, documents, keepsakes? The idea that he could be hiding more than just physical items, that he could be keeping a life within a life, made my chest tighten. I crouched lower, my mind racing, considering the implications of every movement. My shoes were cold, gravel pressing painfully against my feet, but I refused to move back. Every detail mattered. The way he placed the boxes, the way he glanced toward the door, the faint rustle of paper as he adjusted the contents. I realized that each small motion was a part of a rhythm, a careful choreography he had practiced without me knowing. I had spent 16 years married to this man, and tonight I was seeing him differently, seeing him as someone who could hold secrets from me with such precision. Suddenly, I heard a faint noise behind me, a scraping sound. I spun slightly, heart pounding, and saw another unit door slowly opening. A shadowy figure emerged, tall, thin, and cautious, carrying a small flashlight. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just David's secret anymore. Someone else was here. I froze, trying to make myself invisible in the dim light, and watched the figure move toward another unit several rows down. The way they handled the boxes was eerily similar to David, almost like they had been trained. My mind raced. Was this an accomplice? Another person aware of his hidden life? The figure paused, looked around briefly, and then disappeared behind the next row of units. My pulse hammered in my ears, louder than the distant hum of the streetlight overhead. The fear and adrenaline combined in a way that made my hands shake. Yet even in that moment, a strange clarity took hold. I wasn't here to confront. I wasn't here to argue. I was here to understand, to observe, to gather pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed until tonight. I took a slow, measured step closer to David's unit, keeping my body low. The smell of metal and cardboard filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of oil and dust. It was oddly domestic for such a sinister moment, the ordinary smells contrasting sharply with the extraordinary tension. I caught a glimpse of his face as he bent down, and he looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from work, but the kind that comes from carrying secrets too heavy to share. My chest tightened at the thought. 16 years of partnership, and I had never noticed the weight he bore silently. Then something unexpected happened. A rat scuttled across the gravel, knocking over a small pile of debris near the back of the row. David jumped slightly, his hand brushing against a box, as if it might topple. I stifled a gasp, barely breathing, and watched him reset everything carefully. The way he treated each box with reverence, caution, even fear, told me more about his intent than any words ever could. This wasn't a casual act. This was deliberate, methodical, and deeply personal. As he adjusted the last box, he paused, turned slightly, and I thought for a brief moment he might sense me. My heart stopped, my stomach knotted, but then he exhaled softly, returned to the box, and continued. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by the bitter taste of realization. I had almost been discovered, and the near miss made the stakes feel real in a way that no thought or suspicion ever could. I decided to move a little closer, inching along the row, careful to stay in shadow. I could see the small dents in the metal doors, the faded numbers, the little scratches that told the story of frequent use. Each detail seemed meaningful now, a coded map to the life David had hidden from me. I felt a strange thrill of dread and empowerment at the same time. I wasn't a passive observer anymore. I was part of this story, walking in the edges of his secret world. I crouched low behind another unit, careful not to make any noise. My breathing was slow, deliberate, even though my heart raced. I tried to focus on each detail: the weight of the boxes, the faint creaks as he adjusted them, the shadows falling across his face. I noticed a slight tremor in his hand, a nervous tick, perhaps, or guilt manifesting physically. It was human, flawed, fragile, and in that human flaw, I saw an opening, a crack in the careful construction of his secret life. For the first time, I considered speaking, calling his name softly, but the sound caught in my throat. No, this moment required silence, observation, patience. Words could ruin everything. Instead, I watched him finish organizing the unit, pushing each box gently into place, checking and rechecking. Then he took a small notebook from his pocket, scribbled something quickly, and tucked it inside a box. My mind reeled. A log, dates, details, proof. He was documenting his secret life as meticulously as he lived it. I realized then that this row of storage units was more than a hiding place. It was a reflection of him, controlled, careful, deliberate, and full of hidden layers I had never glimpsed. My emotions twisted in response: fear, anger, confusion, curiosity, and a growing sense of resolve. I understood something essential in that moment. I didn't have to confront him here. I didn't have to react impulsively. Observation, patience, and careful planning would serve me better than immediate confrontation ever could. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes, time lost meaning in that suspended tension. I stayed crouched, following his movements with my eyes, cataloging everything in my mind: the boxes, the notebook, the meticulous care. I knew that when he left, the story would not end here, but the knowledge I had gained would change everything. Every subtle motion, every deliberate placement, every secretive glance had revealed a side of David that was invisible in daily life, and it terrified me and fascinated me in equal measure. Eventually, David closed the door and left, leaving the unit dark, silent, and impossibly heavy with secrets. I exhaled slowly, my body tense, trembling from the adrenaline and the weight of what I had seen. The strange row of storage units, which at first seemed mundane, had become a theater of revelations, each metal door a portal to hidden truths. And I knew, in that quiet darkness, that nothing in our lives would ever feel ordinary again. The unit door closed behind him with a faint, metallic thud, leaving the space quiet except for the lingering echo of David's movements. I waited a long moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim, shadowed interior of the storage unit. It smelled of cardboard, old paper, and faint mildew, the combination strangely grounding yet unsettling. I had never expected to step inside, yet my curiosity, sharpened by the night's revelations, propelled me forward. Carefully, I nudged the door just enough to slip in, crouching low, careful not to disturb a single box. The first thing I noticed was the sheer order of it all. Boxes stacked with precision, labels carefully written in neat, small handwriting, dates, numbers, initials. Some had familiar handwriting on them, mine from letters and receipts, evidence that he had taken things from our home. A pang of disbelief struck me, followed immediately by a cold, simmering anger. I ran my hands lightly over the topmost box, feeling the texture of brown cardboard, the faint indentations of what was inside. It wasn't just stuff. Each item was a piece of the life he had been quietly dismantling. I began opening boxes, one by one, each revealing a deeper layer of what David had been hiding. There were documents, bank statements, insurance papers, even our tax returns, organized meticulously. The implications were staggering. He hadn't just been keeping secrets. He had been preparing a life that excluded me. The realization hit me like a punch in the chest. Every forgotten conversation, every unexplained expense, every late-night excuse suddenly made sense. This was not an impulsive act. It was a long-term plan executed with surgical precision. Then I found a small notebook, the kind you carry in a pocket, filled with tight, disciplined handwriting. My name appeared frequently, often alongside dates and cryptic notes. Move box 3, check account, keep cash separate. Each line was calculated, methodical. It was as if he had cataloged our entire shared life in secret, dividing it, repackaging it, deciding what he wanted to carry forward alone. The meticulousness of it left me breathless. I could almost hear his voice, calm and assured, as if he believed his secrecy would protect him from judgment, from me. As I dug deeper, I discovered more personal items, photographs from trips we had taken, little keepsakes from anniversaries and birthdays, even letters I had written him years ago. He hadn't destroyed them. He had collected them, separated them from our home, and kept them in his hidden world. The thought of it made my chest tighten, not because of the physical act itself, but because it represented a life hidden from me, constructed silently, deliberately, over months or perhaps years. I felt betrayed in a way that words could barely capture. I paused and leaned back against the wall, staring at the stacked boxes. A slow, shivering awareness settled over me. This wasn't merely about possessions. Each item, each document, each carefully labeled box was a piece of his strategy, a blueprint for leaving me behind, step by step. My mind raced through the months of strange behavior, the nights he claimed to be working late, the dinners he skipped, the errands he ran for work that never seemed to align. They were all part of this hidden narrative he had built, and I had been blind to it, trusting the ordinary rhythm of our lives. I picked up a box labeled with my initials. Inside were documents I had assumed were secure at home, our joint checking account statements, receipts for mortgage payments, utility bills. He had been moving money quietly, shifting assets without telling me. My stomach lurched as the realization set in. Every unexplained financial discrepancy over the past year now had a clear explanation. This wasn't forgetfulness or oversight. It was preparation, careful and calculated. My hands shook as I replaced the box carefully, the sound of cardboard brushing against cardboard feeling like a whisper of warning. A soft scratching sound made me flinch. I froze, straining to hear over the thudding of my own heart. Perhaps it was just a rat again, the same one I had seen earlier skittering across the floor. Or perhaps someone else had returned. My pulse spiked, a reminder that this place, for all its secrets, was not entirely empty. I considered retreating to the car, but something in me, fierce, determined, kept me rooted. I needed to understand the full scope of what he had planned. I opened another box, slightly heavier, and found it filled with clothes, some of mine, some that clearly belonged to him. There was a set of neatly folded shirts, socks, and jackets, each carefully pressed, each organized as if he intended to wear them elsewhere, apart from me. My throat tightened. My hands paused over the folded fabrics. This wasn't just about hiding money or documents. This was about preparing a life, a version of existence that didn't include me. Every folded shirt, every carefully placed item, carried the weight of intention. I sat down on the concrete floor, my back against the cold metal wall, letting the enormity of it settle in. Questions swirled in my mind. How long had he been doing this? How much had he taken without me knowing? How had I missed the signs for so long? Each thought brought a wave of disbelief and sorrow. 16 years of marriage. And now, here I was, piecing together the reality of a secret life I had never imagined. I realized that his meticulous nature, his calm demeanor, his quiet insistence that nothing was wrong, had all been part of the same carefully maintained illusion. As I dug through a smaller box tucked into the corner, I found a stack of envelopes, handwritten, sealed, and dated. My name was on them, but they weren't meant for me. They were letters he had written, never sent, perhaps as reminders of what he intended to do, notes to himself about the life he was building secretly. Reading them felt like stepping into his mind, witnessing his intentions firsthand. Each line carried a sense of detachment and control, an unsettling calm that contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions I felt. Among the letters was one that made me pause, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. He had written about financial strategies, timelines, and even the ideal moment to execute his plan. The language was cold, pragmatic, almost businesslike. It wasn't emotional, it was mechanical. He had calculated each step meticulously, ensuring that when the time came, nothing would disrupt his vision. And here I was, staring at proof of everything, realizing for the first time the depth of planning behind his actions. I noticed then a small, handwritten map tucked behind one of the boxes. It outlined routes, perhaps to banks or other locations marked with dates and times. The precision was alarming. This was more than a private collection. It was operational, intentional, a life carefully mapped out to exclude me while maintaining the illusion of normalcy at home. I felt a cold, fierce determination rise within me. I wouldn't let him assume I was powerless or oblivious. I had seen the plan. I had proof, and now I had clarity. The more I explored, the more I realized he had underestimated me. He had assumed I wouldn't notice the small discrepancies, the minor inconsistencies in our routine. He had assumed I would remain passive, oblivious to the quiet dismantling of our shared life. But his meticulous planning had, ironically, provided me with the tools to see everything clearly. Every label, every document, every note he had carefully prepared now gave me insight into his intentions and, more importantly, into how I could reclaim control. A small piece of paper fell from one of the boxes, fluttering to the concrete floor. I picked it up, and it was a list, dates and amounts, destinations, instructions. It read like a ledger of secret activity, a timeline of preparation for a life he had envisioned without me. My chest tightened as I traced the lines with my finger, the weight of realization pressing down on me. Every skipped conversation, every unexplained errand, every silent evening. Now, they all had a context. I understood the why behind every seemingly innocuous act. I paused, letting myself breathe, absorbing the enormity of it. The unit, the boxes, the notes, the clothes, all of it painted a picture of intention, a life carefully divided. And yet, despite the shock and betrayal, I felt a strange clarity. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't ignorant anymore. I had witnessed the architecture of his plan firsthand, and in that understanding, I found the first glimmer of control. I realized that the moment I had feared for weeks, the unraveling of our life, had arrived, but not in the way I had imagined. It wasn't sudden. It was deliberate. And now, so was I. Hours passed, or it could have been minutes. Time seemed suspended as I examined every detail. I read through another notebook he had tucked behind a stack of boxes, each page meticulous, documenting expenses, assets, and personal belongings with notes on their intended destination. His handwriting was precise, careful, almost obsessive. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow amidst my anger. 16 years of shared life, reduced to entries on paper, as though emotion had no place in the calculations. Finally, I leaned back, exhausted but resolute. I realized something essential. This wasn't about confrontation in the moment. This wasn't about immediate revenge or dramatic scenes. This was about understanding the full scope of his actions and using that knowledge to reclaim the life he had been quietly taking apart. Every box, every note, Every document I had examined tonight would serve as a roadmap, not for anger, but for empowerment. I had seen the full extent of what he had planned, and in that clarity, I found the first stirrings of a strategy, a way to ensure that I would no longer be sidelined in my own life. Sitting on the edge of my bed that night, the notebooks and documents from the storage unit spread across my laptop and the floor, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I had been simmering in shock, disbelief, and anger for hours, but now a sharper focus had emerged. This wasn't about confrontation in the heat of the moment. It was about strategy, about reclaiming control. The meticulous life David had been planning secretly had provided me the blueprint I needed, not to destroy, but to outmaneuver. I started by listing everything I had discovered, the financial records, the boxes, the letters, the detailed logs of movements and purchases. Each entry became a piece of the puzzle, an insight into his mind. As I arranged the information, patterns emerged. Weeks he claimed were busy with work corresponded to nights he had accessed the storage unit. Small amounts moved between accounts, receipts that didn't align with our family budget, all pointing toward a hidden plan he had nurtured in silence. My stomach tightened as I realized the scale of it. This wasn't just a moment of deceit. It was a lifetime of careful planning, and I now had the knowledge to turn it to my advantage. I spent hours in silence, pacing the room, visualizing each step I might take. It had to be precise, calculated, subtle. David had expected compliance, ignorance, or, at worst, a confrontation that would trigger an argument. He hadn't prepared for me to observe, to analyze, to quietly craft my response. And in that knowledge lay the seed of my revenge. Not loud, not visible, but devastating in its quiet efficacy. The first step was gathering information beyond what I had seen in the storage unit. I began tracking patterns I had noticed, but never fully explored. The nights he claimed to be at work late, the errands he ran at odd hours, the people he met discreetly. I paid attention to small details he thought insignificant, coffee cups left at unfamiliar places, new phone numbers on the caller ID, receipts for obscure purchases. Everything mattered. Everything could be used. I became both observer and strategist, calculating without haste. As the days passed, I implemented subtle, deliberate actions. I started monitoring the accounts he had manipulated, cross-referencing dates and transactions with the notebooks I had photographed in secret. Each time he made an unannounced withdrawal, I documented it meticulously, leaving no margin for error. My fingers moved over the keyboard, entering figures into spreadsheets, categorizing items, creating a quiet dossier of evidence. I wasn't angry in the moment. I was clinical, detached, focused on precision. This was my domain now, my silent battlefield. I also began testing his routines, observing how he moved through the house, what habits he relied on. I noticed the small vulnerabilities, the way he left keys in unusual spots, the slight patterns in his timing, the predictable hesitation before certain tasks. These weren't flaws to exploit recklessly, but opportunities to understand him better, to predict his next move. Each observation felt like a small victory, a private reassurance that I could see him for who he truly was, beyond the mask he presented for 16 years. One night, I decided to stage a minor test. I left a receipt for a transaction he had denied making in a visible place, casually mentioning it during dinner. His face tightened imperceptibly, a subtle twitch in his jaw, his hand briefly clenching before he relaxed. I noticed the brief moment of tension, the flicker of unease. I didn't confront him further, didn't accuse, didn't speak more than necessary. The victory was internal. I had demonstrated, silently, that I could influence the narrative without a word. It was quiet, deliberate, and immensely satisfying. The next step required patience and subtlety. I couldn't rush the process. David's planning had been months in the making. I had to be methodical, discreet, and precise. I began staging small changes around the house, minor misplacements, delayed responses, intentional oversights to see if he would notice. Each time he reacted with surprise or subtle anxiety, I cataloged it. The strategy was not chaos, but observation, to understand his habits fully, to create leverage quietly. I also started monitoring the storage unit from a distance, making mental notes of when he visited, how long he stayed, and how he interacted with the boxes. I never approached too closely, always keeping myself unseen. The cold, quiet nights spent in my car outside the facility became ritualistic, a strange combination of suspense and empowerment. The more I observed, the more I realized the depth of his planning, and the more meticulous I became in preparing my own response. In addition to observation, I began leaving small markers, minor shifts in his environment that only I could track. A notebook placed slightly differently, a receipt slipped under a door, a shadow left where he would notice it. These were not confrontations, but signals to myself, a reminder that I was aware, that I had agency. It was a subtle form of control, a way of taking ownership of the narrative he thought he controlled entirely. There was a sense of theatricality to my preparations, though it remained unseen. I would rehearse scenarios quietly in my mind, imagining how he might react to discovering his careful planning exposed, or to finding the life he thought secure subtly dismantled. I imagined confronting him, not with anger, not with tears, but with calm, undeniable clarity. Each mental rehearsal strengthened my resolve, each imagined interaction sharpening my strategy. Yet it wasn't just about observation or strategy, it was also about understanding myself. I reflected on why I had trusted him so implicitly for so long, why I had ignored small suspicions in favor of comfort. That reflection gave me an unexpected power. I realized that my revenge would not be loud or destructive. It would be a measured, precise response, rooted in understanding and clarity. I could dismantle his plans without exposing myself to unnecessary risk. My patience, my focus, and my insight had become my tools. I started documenting everything, creating timelines of transactions, visits, and interactions. I labeled photographs of documents and items in the storage unit, making notes of every irregularity and anomaly. Each entry in my growing dossier represented a step closer to control, a reinforcement of my presence in a narrative he had assumed I would never touch. There was a sense of calm in the meticulousness, a strange satisfaction in building my quiet arsenal. Small, ordinary actions around the house became part of my strategy. I observed him, noticing my subtle changes. A stack of papers slightly rearranged, a kitchen utensil left out of place, a book moved from one shelf to another. Each reaction provided insight, how he responded to deviations, how he recalibrated when his environment shifted. It was fascinating and empowering. I could see the tension growing in him, even subtly, as if my quiet awareness had begun to unsettle the foundation of his careful life. I even enlisted minor distractions, opportunities to observe him indirectly, casual questions at dinner, seemingly innocent comments about errands, subtle mentions of financial matters. His responses were brief, calculated, almost like a dance we had never learned together. I noted each hesitation, each flicker of surprise, each momentary slip. This quiet accumulation of information felt like building a ladder to an advantage I had never expected. I wasn't acting rashly. I was strategizing, preparing, observing every detail. Sleep became a tool, too. I planned my days around his routines, waking slightly earlier to monitor online transactions or small financial anomalies, noticing patterns he had believed invisible. Each day, the quiet control I wielded strengthened. It was not revenge in the conventional sense. It was preparation, empowerment, reclaiming agency. And with each observation, each minor manipulation of his environment, I felt the slow, intoxicating power of knowing what he could not yet see, that I was fully awake, fully aware, and fully capable of responding when the time came. The more I observed, the more creative my preparations became. I began recording discrete notes, hidden behind ordinary objects, mapping not just his physical movements, but his behavioral tendencies. I considered small, nonviolent interventions, shifting financial accounts subtly to regain control, creating small obstacles that would make his meticulous planning harder without alerting him. Each move was quiet, deliberate, like placing pieces on a chessboard with patience and precision. Yet it was not devoid of emotion. Anger and betrayal simmered beneath the surface, but they were controlled, harnessed for clarity. Every strategic observation, every minor adjustment, every quiet intervention was fueled by that mixture of hurt and determination. I understood now that revenge was not about confrontation or chaos. It was about subtle, undeniable influence, about showing him that the life he had thought he controlled was no longer entirely his to command. Days blurred into nights as I continued this quiet preparation. Each night, I would revisit the storage unit notes, the photographs, the timelines. Each day, I would watch him move through his world, noting patterns, inconsistencies, and vulnerabilities. Every discovery fed the plan, every observation strengthened the strategy. I wasn't angry in a fleeting way. I was focused, deliberate, precise. This was my response, slow, calculated, and unrelenting. Finally, after weeks of meticulous observation, preparation, and subtle influence, I realized something profound. This quiet revenge was not just about him. It was about me reclaiming agency, power, and clarity. It was about taking back the narrative of my own life, piece by piece, without ever needing a scene, without confrontation, without chaos. The realization settled over me like a cloak of calm determination. I had prepared my own quiet revenge, and it would be executed with patience, precision, and a sense of inevitable justice. The early morning sun filtered through the blinds, painting stripes of light across the floor, but I barely noticed. My mind was elsewhere, tense with anticipation and a determination that had been building silently for weeks. I had prepared, observed, and strategized. Every small movement, every minor disruption I had created had led to this moment, leaving before he could abandon me on his terms. The quiet revenge I had orchestrated had strengthened me, given me clarity, and now it was time to act, not out of anger, but to reclaim control. I moved silently through the house, careful not to wake him. David was sleeping, oblivious to the storm that had been quietly gathering around him. I paused at the kitchen counter, glancing at the small pile of papers I had carefully compiled over the past weeks: account statements, notes from the storage unit, photographs of boxes, and letters. They weren't for confrontation. They were proof, my silent reassurance that I could navigate what came next without losing myself in panic or fury. My fingers trembled slightly as I packed a small bag. Clothes, essentials, and a few personal items, things I could carry without drawing attention. Every detail mattered. Every movement had been planned to minimize detection and maximize my own sense of safety and autonomy. I thought about leaving a note. I decided against it. This was not a farewell for his comfort. It was an assertion of my independence, a statement that I would not be a passive participant in his hidden life any longer. I walked past the living room, careful to avoid the creaky spots in the floor that he always seemed to notice. I caught sight of him sleeping peacefully, unaware of the reality I had uncovered: the storage units, the plans, the careful architecture of a life that excluded me. I felt no rush to wake him, no desire to yell or accuse. That would have been the easy, visceral response. Instead, I felt calm, deliberate, as if each step I took was a reclamation of the life I had almost lost without knowing it. Stepping outside, the morning air was crisp, sharp against my skin. I inhaled deeply, savoring the sensation of freedom, of moving toward a life I would define for myself. The quiet of the neighborhood was deceptive. To an outsider, it was ordinary, mundane, but I felt the weight of every secret and every plan that had been hidden from me. The storage unit on Hillcrest Road loomed in my mind, the boxes, the letters, and the notebooks forming a vivid mental map of the betrayal I had unearthed. And yet, beneath that weight, I felt a strange exhilaration. I was no longer blind. I was awake. I was ready. I drove slowly at first, careful to stay unnoticed. Every traffic light, every turn was deliberate. My mind replayed weeks of observation, the small details I had noted, the minor shifts I had orchestrated, and the quiet power they gave me. I thought about David's routines, the patterns I had studied. He would notice my absence, undoubtedly, but he would not understand how prepared I had been, how deliberate my timing was. I had transformed from the wife he assumed compliant and unaware to someone who had quietly reclaimed agency over her own life. Pulling into a small cafe a few blocks from our neighborhood, I parked in a shadowed spot and sat for a few minutes collecting my thoughts. I watched neighbors begin their routines, people jogging, walking dogs, starting cars, sipping coffee. Life seemed normal, ordinary, and yet, for me, it was profoundly altered. Every small step I had taken, every observation, every subtle manipulation, every quiet moment of preparation had led to this, a controlled departure before I could be rendered powerless. I pulled out my phone and reviewed the photographs I had taken from the storage unit. Each image reminded me of the meticulousness of his plan, labeled boxes, handwritten notes, and carefully documented financial movements. The thought of it once made me feel small, helpless. Now it gave me strength. I understood the architecture of his actions, and knowing it allowed me to move freely, confidently, without panic. The revenge I had prepared wasn't violent or dramatic. It was rooted in awareness and control. While sipping my coffee, I began mapping my immediate future. I didn't have a grand plan for confrontation, for dramatics, or for retaliation. My goal was autonomy, safety, and clarity. I thought about the storage unit, the documents, and the boxes he had organized. I knew I could return later if needed, armed with the evidence I had collected. But for now, leaving quietly was more than enough. It was the statement itself. I would not be abandoned silently or secretly. I would leave on my own terms. After a few minutes, I started driving again, moving toward a friend's house where I could regroup. I passed streets I knew intimately, noticing subtle details I had ignored in the past, the worn sidewalk outside a neighbor's house, the wind chimes on a porch, the faint scent of freshly baked bread drifting from a bakery. These small observations grounded me, reminded me of the ordinary beauty of life outside betrayal. Even in this act of escape, I felt alive, alert, and in control. By the time I arrived at my friend's house, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and clarity. We hugged tightly when I explained briefly that I needed a temporary place without going into details. Her quiet understanding, her absence of judgment, grounded me. I unpacked the bag, slowly, deliberately, taking time to breathe and reflect. Every item, every photograph, every note I had carried was a tangible reminder that I had prepared for this moment with care. I was not running blindly. I was reclaiming the life that David had attempted to separate from me. I spent hours reviewing the documents again, cross-referencing, making notes, cataloging evidence. I thought about the legal and financial implications, but more than that, I thought about my own sense of self. I realized that leaving before he could abandon me was not just a physical action. It was a profound psychological victory. He had built a life in secret, but he had not anticipated that I could quietly see it, understand it, and act before he could fully realize his plan. That realization fueled my resolve further. As evening approached, I stepped outside for a walk to clear my mind. The neighborhood streets were bathed in golden light, children playing in yards, neighbors walking dogs, the occasional car passing slowly. I thought about the past weeks, the nights of quiet observation, the meticulous cataloging of his actions, the minor tests and subtle manipulations. Each step had been a preparation for this moment. And now, as I walked, I felt the depth of my own strength, my own agency. The phone buzzed briefly. It was a message from David. Mundane, casual, oblivious to my absence. "Did you forget something?" It read. I smiled faintly. He had no idea. I didn't respond. There was no need. My quiet departure was itself a message. I was not powerless, I was not dependent, and I would not allow his secret planning to dictate the terms of my life. Every unread message, every unacknowledged call, reinforced the control I had silently reclaimed. That night, I lay in the spare bed at my friend's house, unable to sleep fully, but not restless either. I reflected on the journey, from the moment I noticed something was wrong, to the discovery of the storage unit, the realization of his meticulous plans, the preparation of my own quiet response, and finally this controlled departure. Each step had been deliberate, each decision rooted in clarity rather than impulsivity. I felt a calm satisfaction, a quiet empowerment that was far more potent than anger or confrontation could ever be. In the days that followed, I navigated my new reality with the same quiet precision I had developed over the past weeks. I remained aware of David's movements, yet I never confronted, never accused, never allowed the dramatic need for emotional release to overpower strategy. Every phone call, every bank transaction, every note he left unnoticed was cataloged, analyzed, and understood. I had transformed the betrayal into a source of empowerment, and every day I felt increasingly free. One afternoon, I revisited the documents and photographs from the storage unit. I cataloged them meticulously into a binder, creating a complete record of his plans. It was not an act of vengeance, but a safeguard, a confirmation that I had not been blindsided and would never be again. The meticulousness of his planning had, ironically, given me the tools to protect myself and prepare for my future. I marveled at the transformation. The same betrayal that could have destroyed me had instead awakened me to my own power. Even small, everyday moments carried significance. Brewing coffee, walking to the store, arranging my new living space, all became exercises in quiet assertion. I was present, aware, and deliberate in ways I had never been before. The betrayal had not diminished me, it had sharpened me. I realized that leaving before he could abandon me was not just an act of escape. It was a reclaiming of agency, a declaration that I would define my life, not him. Finally, after weeks of careful observation, preparation, and reflection, I allowed myself a sense of peace. I was no longer living in the shadow of his secret plans, no longer waiting for the inevitable moment of abandonment. I had acted first, deliberately, quietly, and without spectacle. The weight of betrayal remained, but it no longer defined me. I had transformed it into clarity, empowerment, and control. I had left on my own terms before he could dictate the narrative of my life. And that truth was profoundly liberating. As I sit here now, weeks after leaving, I can finally breathe without the weight of secrets pressing on my chest. The house I once called home, the life I shared with David, all of it belongs to the past now, not because it was taken from me, but because I chose to step away on my own terms. I've realized that leaving before he could abandon me wasn't just about physical escape. It was about reclaiming every piece of myself he thought he could control. The meticulous planning he had invested in hiding his intentions, in orchestrating a life without me, inadvertently gave me insight into the truth, and, more importantly, gave me the tools to respond with clarity, foresight, and strength. There's a strange sense of gratitude in that realization. Bitter though it may be, betrayal, as cruel as it felt, forced me to awaken, to see clearly, to trust my instincts in ways I had long ignored. I've spent long hours reflecting on the person I've become through this process. The Francesca who discovered the storage unit, who cataloged boxes, letters, and notebooks, who observed quietly and planned deliberately. She is not the same woman who went through life blindly trusting, assuming that love and routine were sufficient shields against deception. She is more vigilant, more aware, and perhaps most importantly, more compassionate toward herself. I've learned that empowerment is not loud. It is quiet, deliberate, and patient. It is in understanding one's circumstances, assessing every detail, and moving thoughtfully rather than reacting impulsively. My revenge was never about drama or punishment. It was about survival, clarity, and reclaiming my autonomy in a world where someone else had tried to dictate the terms of my life. Even in moments of solitude, I find comfort in the quiet power I've built. Small victories, paying my own bills, organizing my life independently, reclaiming memories that weren't tainted by his secrecy, have become symbols of resilience. I no longer dwell on what might have been, nor do I fantasize about confrontation. The freedom I sought was never about vengeance against him, but about freedom from fear, from uncertainty, from the feeling that my life could be quietly dismantled without my knowledge. By leaving on my terms, I shifted the narrative entirely. I am no longer a passive character in his story. I am the author of my own. I've also realized the importance of trust, not blind trust, but discernment. People may surprise us, disappoint us, or deceive us, but that does not diminish our ability to recover, to protect ourselves, and to move forward with dignity. My journey through betrayal has taught me that self-respect is far more valuable than anger, confrontation, or retribution. Walking away quietly, deliberately, allowed me to retain that respect and preserve my sense of self intact. And now, as the sun sets each evening, casting long shadows across my new surroundings, I feel an unfamiliar lightness. I am no longer tethered to his plans or secrets. I have reclaimed my life, step by step, choice by choice. The past remains a lesson, not a prison. I am free, not in the way one escapes danger, but in the way one finally recognizes their own strength, their own worth, and the undeniable truth that no one can ever quietly take that from them without consent. I am Francesca, I am aware, and I am in control.